There was a sign painter shop in my neighborhood in Syracuse, and I thought I would just watch them work, and they allowed me to sit and watch them work, and eventually they said, well, why don't you try to do prime all the plyboard signs or cardboard for them to do the lettering. And eventually they gave me a brush and said, could you do these big block letters? So I slowly did more and more, though I was never as fluid as, you know, the guys who have 30 years of experience when they...
I mean, it almost starts to feel like an apprenticeship model, but unofficially.
Yeah, it felt like that. And I only spent a couple hours a day there. So I would do a little bit of that, and then I'd go back to my house and practice my calligraphy. And little by little, word of mouth, you know, worked a bit on doing some calligraphic honor rolls for the local museum. And, you know, one thing leads to another. And if you stay engaged in whatever discipline you think you're good at, and you're any good at it, I think opportunities just appear.
Yeah.
Or if you're lucky, they do.
And it seems to have captured your interest for the past several decades. Like for you, have you seen some sort of arc of its evolution over time?
Yeah, I think so. There's certainly a lot of confidence where there wasn't any in the beginning.
That helps, yeah.
I think that helps really improve your work too. But the more, it's funny because the more type I've done, digital type, the less calligraphy I've done. So there's been kind of a trade-off in the working directly and making letters by hand to the digital process, which in a way kind of removes you from the warmth and humanity of it. So you have to kind of build that back into digital type. And that's a challenge for type designers. So for me, having had the calligraphic background and experience, it seems more natural for me to include that in my type work.
Yeah. And teaching type design at RISD, do you actually encourage them to draw everything out first on paper?
I do. And actually the first class is spent with a calligraphy workshop. So I do want my students to understand the nature and the origin of Latin letter forms. And the best way to do that is with a broad-edged pen. And I think it helps their type work.
Yeah, I'm sure.
To have gone through that process. Even though it's just a 5-hour studio, I said, you know, none of you are really going to become necessarily calligraphers from this workshop, but I think it'll help inform your type work. But you asked me about the curriculum and whether it's something I can create. It was kind of handed to me by by Cyrus Highsmith, who taught the undergrads before he moved on to the graduate program. And I said, so what do you teach them? Because this is the first time I was teaching type design in this formal setting. So he said, well, this is what I do. So I kind of used his curriculum, and I thought it worked really well. And over the years, I've been there 8 years. I've kind of customized it to kind of more of my approach. But it hasn't changed that much. It's a lot of hands-on exercise, even paper cutting, to try to understand the structural nature of letter forms and the negative space and the interaction between them.
Well, and I really feel like the syllabus is a living document. There's only so much you can capture in text. And of course, we're creating some scaffolding, but when you start doing those projects or exercises as a class, it wildly changes the type of learning you're going to do that doesn't necessarily translate into the syllabus.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's also evolved over time in the various times you've taught this class.
Yeah. Sometimes you can get a sense from the experience of the students and what they bring to this kind of discipline, what they might be better at focusing on. But I try not to give everybody too much free rein because I think structure counts for a lot in the classroom.
Sure, of course.
And I think students like that structure too. You know, what do we do next? What comes next? And they can make sense out of it. It gives them a little more confidence. So when you teach, how do you start sitting in a classroom with however many students you have?
Yeah, I feel like typically I teach studio classes. So the classes stay fairly small, 8 to 15. But I wonder if you actually deal with this too. When you're approaching technical material, I feel like people come into the class with a certain fear or intimidation because they have a preconceived notion about what that does. So when I'm teaching a coding class, people are like, I don't know how to code, even if they've never coded before. So I think once you teach them this kind of scaffolding and how playful it can be, how we actually expect things to break, and if they're not breaking, then maybe you're not taking enough risks in the code, then I feel like that kind of removes this thing, because we're not trying to seek perfection, right? We're trying to learn this thing, and then in doing so, we happen to expand our skill set. And then you also end up with these really novel forms online that you don't typically see in like more polished commercial websites. Yeah. So I feel like that kind of energy, I would hope they bring into their client work after they graduate.
How much typography do you talk about or try to include or get them to engage with when you're teaching your particular subject matter?
I've been quite a bit. I feel like the origins of online publishing was really typographic. So we talk about system fonts, we talk about how to load in these other things, we talk about dynamic typography or kinetic type. All of these things are things you can play with. And I feel like it's just a nice way to bridge with some of their other courses where they're actually designing type for the first time. But in my class, I really try to push forward the research and historical aspect. What are the references that they're pulling into these projects? It shouldn't only be about some sort of skin or style.
Yeah.
So for your type design students, what does that research project process look like? Do you have them do a lot of historical precedents or studies beforehand?
Not so much. Mostly, it's a single elective they get to take in type design.
Yeah.
So they kind of get one shot at it.
Yeah.
And what I like to teach is like the hardest process possible, which is designing a text typeface. Yeah. So I usually give them the structure around that is to choose a novel or poetry or song lyric that can give you a sense of a particular author's voice and try to hear that voice and turn it into a visual system, which would be the typeface. Some students do that more successfully than others. They can translate the fiction or prose that they're choosing into actual letter forms, or others tend to struggle with it a little more. And I think part of the process is to see the change that takes place as they become more comfortable with drawing and designing type and trying to stick to the original proposal. So only in that sense is there any research done as far as, I think they'll look at a lot of typefaces. I'll say pick 3 typefaces that you are maybe somewhat familiar with that might be appropriate for this project. So they have to dig a little bit deeper into thinking about almost what Abbott Miller was talking about. What personalities do these typefaces have, and will they be appropriate for my project, and how can I modify or customize them to become that?
Well, and there's a lot of subjectivity and like empathy in the prompt, right? Like how do you represent someone else's voice? Yes. That's like a huge responsibility in many ways.
Yeah, and very difficult.
Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that they're all particularly successful, but they learn just from the process.
Sure,
anyway.
Of course. Yeah.
It's always really interesting to see what students come up with. I think most of the text typefaces that they do design are really very legible, and some are aesthetically very pleasing. And I always enjoy seeing shapes I've never seen before, or an approach that I have never experienced. Because at some point, as a teacher or as a type designer for 45 years, you feel like I've seen everything. I've seen every approach. But I love to be surprised. Mm-hmm. And I love teaching because I'm always surprised. Yeah. And I feel like I learn almost as much from their contribution in class that they give, that I give them, which is always a nice interaction.
Definitely.
Do you feel that too?
I feel like there's this natural peer teaching or like cyclical teaching thing that happens in an environment where perhaps we're facilitating and offering some scaffolding as a syllabus, and we have some predetermined exercises, but ultimately, like the discursive nature of studio is really what brings in all these other references, all these other perspectives. So I do feel like I'm always left to class feeling quite surprised and like inspired and maybe hungry to do more research. So I feel like I'm on top of like what's new and cutting edge. but also just a different perspective that I hadn't considered. So I definitely try to push forward this kind of peer teaching, me as facilitator role.
And do you feel very successful? Do you get a lot of good conversations in class?
Sometimes. It really depends on, I feel like a lot of it is certain forms of advocacy because different people communicate in different ways. So we do this thing called a group agreement, where it's kind of like a consensual code of conduct, all created by the class, enforced by the class throughout the semester. So if someone doesn't feel comfortable talking in class, they might write it down instead, or offer some sort of different way of disseminating that feedback. But of course, we have like verbal discussions in class as well, but just trying to support the different ways that people want to contribute or not.
Right.
Yeah.
It must be pretty energizing.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah.
But I think it's just like a certain form of care that we're trying to bring into the classroom, right? I don't think the competitive nature, we want everything to be constructive. Yeah. Of course, it's always a work in progress, right? These things are very mutable, and we like encourage cycling back to it, making amends, and then trying to enforce that just roll that into the curriculum again, moving forward.
I noticed in your presentation that you have a liking for lower resolution types. Could you tell me more about that?
I think it's just the nature of cyberfeminism and where it started. Like a lot of these things that we were scraping from Web 1.0 just happens to be a very low bandwidth, low res artifacts on these old NetArt sites. I think it's also partly because of the way it was captured through the Wayback Machine from the Internet Archive. It just really reduces the file size. So instead of trying to like make it feel high resolution or something that is much more modernized, I think just leaving it in the browser, scaling it up, really exaggerating that pixel, it gives it a nice place and time that I thought was a nice situated context. I also generally don't worry too much about making something feel perfect. I feel like sometimes by embracing these broken parts or these errors, you're actually kind of emphasizing a lot of the things or concepts that you're trying to push forward.
So in part, the low-res type represents a period of time where a lot of this thought process for cyberfeminism began, and you want to carry that aesthetic through to now without polishing it or making it look contemporary or too slick. Because then it just becomes marketing.
Of course, yeah. And then when you then compare this to a lot of contemporary typographic works in the cyberfeminist, like anti-canon, they are actually quite high resolution, and they have like they're using like variable types, and they're using 3 dimensions, and it's a nice way to show the evolution of typography in this kind of medium, just by showing low to high bandwidth or resolution.
Yeah. Do you feel the slicker, more contemporary variable font messaging is not authentic?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just a replication of the type of technology we have access to. The tech we have access to now is faster, lighter, maybe not more experimental, but it allows you to make things that have a little more high gloss than things from 30 years ago, understandably. That said, I do feel like there is a resurgence of this like old web aesthetic now. Even my personal website is just like very basic HTML and CSS. What Olia Leolina calls the prof doc style, professor, doctor, like all these PhD pages were always made in this thing, just for easy updating. But still, I just think generally these aesthetics and waves and styles are cyclical, and they inform each other and evolve. And I'm sure you see this in type design as well.
Yeah. It comes around, it all comes around.
Yeah.
Fashion comes around, music comes around.
Everything kind of responds to each other.
Yeah, and different periods of time. So I don't know, fashion every 20 years maybe, or 30 years, you get to see the same old bell-bottom jeans now.
Oh, absolutely. In my classes, I'm like, it feels like the 90s are back
all
in
over
my
again.
classroom.
Yeah, and you better have liked the 90s to want to see it again.
Yeah, I mean, there were good and bad things. So, and good and bad things have come back. So
That's true. That's very true.